I think we're on the eve of a big turning point in the Middle East. And this is the second time in Arab history since the Second World War that this is taking place. The first turning point was the rise of Arab nationalism to get rid of colonialism, to get rid of imperialism in that region. And that, interestingly enough, did not start with mass upheavals from below, but it started with, of course, a strong anti-imperialist nationalist movement, which triggered off a grouping inside the Egyptian army, the Free Officers, which broke the army, seized power, and the mobilizations that followed after that. And the victory, of course, of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt did lead to huge mobilizations. When he nationalized the Suez Canal, in the face of huge opposition from the imperialist powers, and said, let the imperialists choke in their rage, the canal belongs to us, there were millions of people in the streets of Cairo, Alexandria, Suez, and even in small towns, listening to it on the radio, because this was the pre-television age. And there were huge mobilizations in Iraq when the radical communists and nationalists inside the Iraqi army mimicked the Egyptians and got rid of the monarchy in their country, making the revolution in '58. And there was for a time a hope that the Arab nation would unite with three concurrent capitals, Damascus, Cairo, Baghdad. And this hope was the nightmare for the West. And the '67 defeat, organized by the West, delivered by the Israelis, was a defeat that went very deep indeed. And that was the defeat that broke the back of Arab nationalism. But look at the contrast. When Nasser realized that they had been defeated, he went on television, which existed by then, and said, I take full responsibility for this defeat. I was the leader of the Egyptian people, led the armies to defeat, I resign. And he left the television studio. And that, as news spread, millions assembled in the squares and streets of Cairo to say, don't resign, we need you. Because they knew who was plotting to replace him. Their instincts warned them. And he died broken-hearted 2 years later, with not much money in his bank account. And you compare him to this joker who is ruling Egypt today, whose assets, his family assets have been, we are told, amount to $40 billion. Money stolen from the Egyptian people, looted from its treasury. And this is the guy the West tells us is absolutely essential, is necessary to keep. And when you say he has to go, some they reply perhaps, but then he should be replaced by Suleiman. And Suleiman, who's now under US pressure been appointed Mubarak's vice president, is a torturer. I don't mean he orders torture, he does that. He is actually a torturer himself. And just in case you think I'm exaggerating, let me read from a book by The Dark Side by Jane Meyer, New Yorker correspondent. Each rendition was authorized at the very top levels of both governments, the US and Egypt. The long-serving chief of the Egyptian Central Intelligence Agency, Omar Suleiman, negotiated directly with top CIA officials. Former US Ambassador to Egypt, Edward Walker, described the Egyptian counterpart Suleiman as, quote, very bright, very realistic, adding that he was cognizant that there was a downside to, quote, some of the negative things that he engaged in, of torture and so on, but he was not squeamish, by the way. And here is an account by Mamdouh Habib, an Egyptian-born Australian citizen who was seized from a bus in Pakistan, sent to Egypt by the CIA, tortured. I mean, I won't go into the details of the torture, it's horrific. Habib writes in his memoir, "My story, the tale of a terrorist who wasn't. Electric shocks, water up to his nostrils, beaten. His fingers were broken. At one point, his interrogator slapped him so hard that his blindfold was dislodged, revealing the identity of his tormentor, Suleiman, the current vice president of Egypt, appointed by Washington. Frustrated that Habib was not providing useful information or confessing to involvement in terrorism, Suleiman ordered a guard to murder a shackled prisoner in front of Habib, which he did with a vicious karate kick." This is the man who is now the vice president of Egypt and the hope of the West in case Mubarak has to go. But they don't want Mubarak to go because they know what our comrades have been telling us from Egypt, that the fall of Mubarak, regardless of who succeeds him, is going to be a huge blow against imperial interests in the entire Middle East. For years now, the imperialist project in the Middle East has relied not just on Israel, that's important, we know, that's a permanent, but it has relied on Saudi Arabia and, more importantly, Egypt, because it's the most populous country with a huge army, standing army. It has depended on them to make sure that nothing really shakes. And with Egypt shaking, everything could shake. And they know that, which is why they want to organize it carefully, so that it is seen he's removed after an election in which they'll half try and half rig it, but allow something else to happen, and not removed by a popular upheaval. That is what they don't want to show. But it could happen despite them, because powerful and strong as they are, they cannot control everything all over the world, as they're experiencing and as we're experiencing. So there is a lot of hope left. And I am moderately optimistic that with the mass mobilizations continuing, Mubarak will go. But one point I think we have to understand, which many people underestimate sometimes, that the historic memory of the Arab nation is still there. It doesn't go away. People get beaten, they are demoralized, they are angry, they are embittered, they remain passive for decades, and then they rise. And this time the rising started in Tunisia. And that had a huge impact. And one reason that had a huge impact was because it also affected the political pride of the other nations and its citizens. The Tunisians have done it? But it's true. The Tunisians have done it, considered by the entire Arab world as the softest people in the Arab region, who never do too much, enjoy life and carry on. They did it, and they did it with enormous courage and dignity. And the fact that the Tunisians managed to get that dictator, that despot on a plane, getting out of the country triggered off this Arab national uprising in all these countries. Egypt, of course, is the most important, but look what happened in Yemen, where another Abdullah, there are too many Abdullahs in the Iranian Abdullah of Yemen, Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, Abdullah of Jordan, You know what Abdullah means? Slave of God. I have a known name for them. Abdul America. They're slaves of the United States of America. But in Yemen, it triggered off mass demonstrations in Sana'a. And you know, the Yemeni government has its own people who pretend to be Al-Qaeda. I was there last year and people told me, I said, well, where's Al-Qaeda? Tell me, where is it? And they said, lots of Yemeni, especially socialists in the south, they whispered in my ear, Al-Qaeda in Yemen is 200 people who live in an office close to the president's court. He sends them out to get more money from America. And especially the southerners in Yemen hate the regime in the north. And they now have allies in the north. So Yemen is shaking and a concession has been made. A concession has been made in Yemen. Abdullah says, I won't run again, I promise, and nor will I impose my son on you, but let me stay till my time is up. And they're saying no. In Jordan, it's not just the Palestinian citizens of Jordan, but 3 leading Bedouin tribes who have said enough is enough, and 2 of the generals belonging to these tribes marched on the streets with the people. And if any country in the Middle East can be described accurately and scientifically as an Israeli-American protectorate, it is Jordan. And the Israeli regime has said that if the monarchy is thrown, they haven't said it now, by the way, they've said it for 4 years and they repeat it, if the Jordanian monarchy is thrown, it will be our duty to restore it. I bet it is. So the wave of upheavals that we are seeing are spreading throughout the Arab world. And what they remind me of really is nothing that has been witnessed in that world before, but in a way something that was observed in Europe in the 19th century as despots and dictators and empires were being fought. And that is the wave of revolutions of 1848, which challenged those despotisms. Some succeeded, some didn't. But what it created was a new mood in Europe which kept on maturing. And it wasn't until 60 years later, I hope it'll be sooner in the Arab world, that old empires were crushed and a new wave of revolutions took the world over. So what is happening is of extreme importance. It is a turning point. Question which worries me, people have said we shouldn't be too, bad things could happen. Of course they could. Counter-revolutions remain alive forever. Revolutions succeed, settle down, counter-revolutions remain alive. And even as we meet here, have no doubt that in the Pentagon and the White House they are planning what to do if we have to take him out. Who are we going to deal with? Who are we going to put in power? How are we going to curb the masses down? The comrade from Tunisia has described what they're doing in Tunisia. They'll try similar things in Egypt. But it's not going to be so easy. So there is a lot to play for yet in what is taking place in the Arab world. And this could, as other speakers have said, extend way beyond the borders of the Arab world. In Tunisia, many people are talking about a constituent assembly and a new constitution in which social, economic and political rights are institutionalized. Actually, it wouldn't be too different from the Venezuelan constitution, the new one which the masses voted for. We're thinking about that. And similar things need to be done in Egypt in order to institutionalize the shift when it takes place. Meanwhile, will Mubarak go or not will depend on 2 things. Whether the Americans will order the generals to fire and create a Tiananmen Square in Tahrir Square, whether they will do that, and whether the generals will obey, knowing full well that the army is divided. These are the things we have to watch for. If Mubarak really had some intelligence, he would decide now to leave of his own accord. he has cohabited now with 5 American presidents. And even Cleopatra got tired after 3 imperials.